I was talking to a Gen X about consent recently, and they brought up the very classic saying, no means no. But I told them that saying is very outdated since there's a lot of cases where people don't say no, but it still classifies as simply because sometimes people freeze up, some people are asleep, some don't feel safe enough to say no, or some are just afraid of their abuser overpowering them, whether that be physical or influential power. There are a plethora of cases where someone just couldn't simply say no. To kind of give an example, I remember one time when I was a teenager and I was out with my caretaker, and we met up with their great uncle who had brought his girlfriend along. We were all sitting and this woman kept touching my leg. I politely asked her to stop because I just simply don't like being touched. But apparently that wasn't a good enough excuse since my caretaker for the day quietly scolded me, saying that I was being rude. The girlfriend backed off, but then a bit later she was complimenting my hair, usually not that big of a deal, but she decided to touch my hair that I had in front of my chest like this, and then ended up touching my chest. I again said, don't touch me or my hair because I don't like being touched, but my caretaker got mad at me. Again. I think about this story often, mostly because later when I told this story in front of the caretaker, they said, yeah, that was weird, that's why I backed you up and told her to stop. Which ticked me off so much, but my experience is not an original one. It really saddens me to be aware that this story is only one part of a larger problem. Like, how was my comfort less important than being polite? The adults in this situation genuinely believed that me setting boundaries was somehow more offensive than this stranger's inappropriate actions. Everyone in the story was boomers, the generation who thought this kiss was romantic, so I guess I shouldn't be surprised. But I can't help but wonder how many children, especially ones who are raised by boomers, have been taught to put up with abusive behavior for the sake of respecting your elders. How many kids have been forced to stay silent or endure inappropriate behavior because the adults in their lives was more concerned about being respectful than protecting them? It's a mentality that's left so many children feeling unsafe and unheard, all in the name of good manners. That's one of the many reasons that some people just feel like they can't say no. It's not always about the word itself, but sometimes it's just about the pressure, the fear of consequences, or even the conditioning that they've been subjected to over time. Whether it's the fear of disrespecting an elder, as I mentioned earlier, or a power dynamic that leaves someone feeling trapped. Saying no isn't as simple as it seems. And I wish more people would realize that, because just because someone doesn't explicitly say no doesn't mean that they were genuinely comfortable or willing. Even the news saying that they changed from no means no into yes means yes doesn't feel valid to me either. A very relevant example is when an adult attempts to sexually abuse a minor. And yes, it is always sexual abuse. It doesn't matter if the minor claims to enjoy it, initiates the interaction, or is close to the age of consent. The power imbalance makes it inherently abusive. A minor is not in any position to give true consent because they lack the maturity, understanding, and agency to navigate such dynamics. The adult in this situation always holds responsibility due to their position of authority, maturity, and legal accountability. I don't know why this take isn't universal, because I saw this silly, unserious video where it said how if a 16-year-old feels after getting into a relationship with a married man. Was it made by another clueless teenager? Probably. But what struck me was the angle. So I commented, why aren't we blaming the grown married man? The creator pinned my comment and then liked the comment that replied, we blame both. Oh, do we? Because where's the second video that says how married men feel after grooming a 16-year-old girl while having an adult wife? Because I don't see it. Do we really blame both? And even if we did, why? Not to sound like a broken record, but does the teenager who's bored and the man who's not only cheating on his wife but also thinks his 16-year-old girl is a possible love interest have equal blame here? It's so weird in situations like this where the blame gets split or even misplaced, when to me, it feels obvious where the blame should be going. It's like a pilot calling a passenger into the cockpit and saying, hey, you should totally fly this plane, you'd be amazing at it. Sure, you've watched a couple YouTube videos on flying, and you've always thought it looked cool, so you figure, why not? But once you're at the controls, you crash the plane into the ocean. Now, whose fault is it? The passenger who had zero qualifications? Or the pilot who gave up control of a multi-ton flying machine to someone with no training? The pilot has the knowledge, maturity, and accountability. And sure, the passenger made a poor choice in engaging, but the pilot is the one who enabled the situation and should have known better. Pilots are supposed to navigate responsibly and not let things spiral into disaster. You understand what I'm saying? I believe that the victim is the only person who has the right to question their actions in situations of abuse or exploitation. It's often a natural, though unfair, response for victims to replay events in their mind, asking, why didn't I fight harder? Why didn't I run? Why didn't I say no louder? This internal questioning actually stems from the need to regain control over a situation where they had none. It's a way for the mind to process trauma. It's not an invitation for outsiders to pile on blame. It's always so irritating to me when others echoes those doubts, turning a victim's natural reflection into external judgment. Instead of supporting victims, people often reinforce the bizarre idea that they're somehow responsible for what happened. Oh, don't worry, the victim is already blaming themselves, wondering what they could have done differently. Your job isn't to confirm their beliefs, it's to provide empathy and create a space for healing. Doesn't matter if the abuser is family, wealthy, influential, or a total stranger. As an outsider, it is easy to analyze the situation with clarity and hindsight. But remember, you're observing from a safe distance. In the moment, fear and manipulation warps a victim's ability to respond in ways that might seem obvious later. Deep down, victims question themselves because society has conditioned us to believe that we're in control of every situation. But trauma responses like freezing, complying, or shutting down aren't weaknesses, they're survival mechanisms. Outsiders, especially those not involved in the situation, should recognize the abuser's choices were the reasons that the victors made the wrong responses in the first place. The same thing with those outsiders demanding forgiveness from the victim. There is only one person who has the right to forgive, and that's the person who was hurt. Forgiveness isn't a group decision, and outsiders have no business demanding it on a victim's behalf, especially if the perpetrator hasn't even faced consequences for their actions. The rush to push forgiveness, often under the guise of letting go of hatred, is nothing more than a shallow attempt to gloss over the pain. Healing is a deeply personal process that takes time, effort, and most importantly, the victim's own choice. Pushing someone to forgive before they're ready is so inconsiderate to what they've gone through and paints the victim as the bad guy for holding grudges. If they decide to live with their anger or grief for a while or even forever, that's their right. Healing isn't about meeting a socially acceptable timeline, it's about reclaiming control over their life in whatever way feels right to them. But it's been long enough, let it go already. Ooh, let me stop you right there. I don't know if you thought this was about deciding who gets the last slice of pizza. This is about someone's pain, autonomy, and dignity. You have no place rushing them through it just to make yourself or the perpetrator feel more comfortable. It's even more embarrassing when the outsiders go out of their way to excuse or plead forgiveness for influencers or celebrities they've never met. That is a whole other level of misplaced loyalty. It's one thing to make excuses for someone you know personally, like a friend or family member, but bending over backwards to defend celebrities who don't even know who you are? Celebrities and influencers aren't immune to accountability just because they've made you laugh in a YouTube video or released a song that got you through tough times. There were two instances for me where creators I admired for years faced sexual assault allegations. When the allegations surfaced, I felt sad. But you know what else I did? I believed the victims. I know it's painful to see someone you've admired fall from grace, but influencers aren't your friends. You don't know them personally, you don't know what they're like off camera, how much of their good person image is curated by a savvy PR team, or what they might be capable of behind closed doors. I have no right to determine, I don't think this person who I've only interacted with through a comment section would do something like this. What I can determine is that being a victim of sexual assault is a horrifying experience to live through. To not be believed on top of that, to see the person who hurt you continue living a celebrated life while you are carrying the weight of that pain alone, it's unfair on every level. One of these cases involved a 17-year-old victim and a 25-year-old accused. In California, where the age of consent is 18, yet so many excuse it by saying 17 is basically an adult. No. 18 is barely an adult. There's a world of difference between a high schooler prepping for prom and SATs and a grown adult ready to graduate from a prestigious university. If your stance on this is only swayed by the law, it suggests you'd lower your standards if the law allowed it. And frankly, that's terrifying. 17 is old enough to know what they were doing. Teenagers are kids. They're in that awkward phase where they're not children anymore but are still expected to act like adults, and sometimes they take it too far. But as the grown-up in this scenario, you should know better. You have outgrown the impulsiveness of teenage years by now. It is your responsibility as an adult to recognize that this kind of relationship is wrong. Age gaps in relationships aren't inherently problematic when both individuals are at similar stages in life. For instance, like a 35-year-old dating a 45-year-old is often fine because they both likely share a comparable life experience and emotional maturity. But when one person is still developing their frontal lobe like a 15-year-old and a 25-year-old, it's not about the age gap itself, but the imbalance in life stages and understanding. A 15-year-old is navigating adolescence while someone in their mid-20s is expected to be firmly in adulthood. This disparity creates a dynamic where the older person holds much more influence and control whether they intended to or not. Well, maybe the 15-year-old is smarter or more emotionally mature than the 25-year-old. That doesn't matter. A 25-year-old has had years of autonomy while a 15-year-old is just beginning to grasp independence. This stark difference creates opportunities for manipulation even if the teenager feels like they're the ones in control. Relationships should be built on mutual equality, and in this scenario, equality is impossible. It's the older individual's responsibility to respect boundaries and not exploit their advantage. Even if the older person waits for the younger one to be legal, it's still wrong because the foundation of that relationship was built on a power imbalance and grooming. If you're 25, you should not be waiting for a 15-year-old to age up as if they're a video game character leveling up. You've already established a dynamic where you're the one in control, and turning it legal doesn't erase the manipulation or intent behind it. Waiting just masks you under a veneer of legality and doesn't change the fact that it's inherently exploitation. In both of these cases that I talked about, the creator's excuse was that they didn't say no. For people who've never thought deeply about consent, this might sound like a valid defense. It's the victim's fault because they didn't say no. Wrong! If you're the one initiating something intimate, it's on you to pick up on social cues and communicate clearly. Misunderstandings can happen, sure, but that doesn't absolve you of responsibility. Consent is your job to ensure, not theirs to prove retroactively. Yes, social cues can be very complicated, but that's why it's so important to slow down, communicate, and actually care about your partner's boundaries. Pay attention to what they're expressing, not just words, but in actions too. It's easier to ask permission in the bedroom than to ask forgiveness in the courtroom, but this isn't just about covering your own ass either. It's about making sure the person you're with feels safe and respected. Asking outright or even multiple times, "Are you okay with this?" doesn't ruin the moment, but actually sometimes makes the person want it even more because of the fact that they recognize that you're prioritizing their safety and comfort. But also remember that consent is not a one-time unchangeable agreement either. If someone says, "Actually, can we stop?" you stop. It doesn't matter if they agreed 10 minutes ago, 5 minutes ago, or even just before. You should be happy to respect someone's boundaries in real time, not backing them up into a decision that they're no longer comfortable with. People might change their minds because they feel discomfort, pain, or unease, or maybe because they've simply decided that they no longer want to continue. But you don't need to find their reasoning to make sense, because whatever their reason is doesn't need justification. Your job isn't to question their decision, but to honor it immediately. This principle applies in every context, from casual interactions to intimate moments. If you're tattooing someone and you've already prepped everything, wiped down their skin, and applied the stencil and set up your station, but they suddenly say, "Actually, I changed my mind, I don't want a tattoo," you don't force them to go through with it just because you're ready or it's inconvenient to stop. I know that it might be frustrating to halt the process, but their decision trumps your convenience. Consent can be given and it can be taken away. Normalizing the idea that consent is fluid creates a safer environment for everyone where boundaries are genuinely respected at every step. Failing to do that risks emotional and psychological harm, and that's not a risk anyone should be willing to take. The goal of holding people accountable, even those we look up to, isn't about cancel culture or blindly choosing a side, because obviously you shouldn't take anything at face value, but ultimately it's about fairness and empathy. When we focus on what the victim supposedly did wrong or argue over technicalities like they didn't say no, we're excusing the actual harmful behavior. Consent isn't just the surface view of saying yes, but actually being in the mental and physical state to fully understand what you're agreeing to, which is why when someone is intoxicated, whether it's alcohol, drugs, or any substance that impairs your ability to think clearly or make decisions, they cannot consent. even if they fully said yes. Like if someone signs a legal contract while they're drunk, that contract can be considered invalid because they weren't in the right state of mind to agree to the terms. When someone is intoxicated, that clarity and capacity for decision making are impaired. I talked about it briefly in my Defending Men video, but I had a friend who got taken advantage of by a woman while they were underage drinking. All of his other friends congratulated him on what happened. Wow, you're so lucky that you got to sleep with a pretty girl at a party. But I was the only one who recognized it for what it was. She was sober, he was blackout drunk. Therefore, she him. I don't care if he was at a party, that he didn't cover his drink, that the woman was also underage, that he was stronger than her, or that you think he probably enjoyed it. I don't fucking care. That mindset is disgusting and dismissive. Consent cannot be given when someone is obviously drunk. And brushing off male victims just because society thinks that men are always willing is dangerous, outdated, and flat out wrong. He didn't ask for it. He couldn't even say no. Male survivors deserve the same empathy and recognition as anyone else. I need people to be louder about holding perpetrators accountable no matter their gender and no matter what they look like. Can we please dismantle this toxic he's lucky narrative that continues to silence male survivors? Later, I was talking about the situation with his friend who was there at the party with him. He was telling me to stop feeling so bad for him because it's his own fault because he took off his shirt at the party and let her dance on him. I actually don't give a flying what he was wearing or what he allowed previously. The mindset that someone is asking for it based on their behavior or clothing is one of the most toxic narratives in existence. If a beautiful naked woman was dancing in front of me, her lack of clothing wouldn't compel me to touch her or make objectifying comments towards her because she is not responsible for what I choose to do. Because I don't have the mind of a rapist. Clothes, or lack thereof, doesn't count as consent. The person who was simply existing in their body or wearing what they wanted to doesn't mean they were telling you with their eyes or body language that they want to be taken advantage of. What someone does is not always based on your assumptions. I wear shorts because I think they're more comfortable than pants, not because I want someone to grab my legs. I grow out my hair because I think it's prettier like that, and sometimes I tie it up because it's practical, not because I want someone to pull on my hair. Actually, when I was younger, I remember I was out with a family member and I said, a lot of old men keep looking at me in the store and how weird it was. And then the grown adults I was with said, if you didn't dress like a slut, they wouldn't look at you. I was wearing a black and white plaid skirt with a red rose on it and a bright hot pink jersey as a top with hot pink Converse that had sparkles and white ankle socks. Probably the most horrendous fit ever, but I wouldn't say it fell into the slut category. I was 11. I remember I purposely wore skirts in middle school so I wouldn't have to sit on the hot melting black top in PE because my school didn't have a gym and I had PE at 2 p.m. in Southern California. They didn't make the kids who wore skirts and dresses sit down, and it'd be weird if they checked whether they had shorts underneath or not. So I wore skirts like that a lot during middle school due to practicality reasons. Blaming an 11-year-old for a middle-aged man's predatory behavior because of their clothing is beyond ridiculous. Why are we so desperate to deflect accountability from the person who is actually at fault? Instead of addressing the grown adult's lack of self-control and predatory mindset, people cling to excuses that shame and blame the victim no matter how illogical. There was a trend a little while ago with easy access clothes where someone jokes about wearing revealing clothing to get attention, and when it works, they lightheartedly call the admirer, usually their romantic partner, a pervert. A very silly, lighthearted trend, I know, but I can't help but overthink about the deeper implications of how we interpret why people dress the way they do. Clothing is not always about seeking attention. It's a form of self-expression, comfort, or practicality. A man taking off his shirt at the gym isn't necessarily showing off. Maybe he's checking his form or avoiding overheating. Similarly, a woman wearing a low-cut top isn't automatically fishing for stares. She could simply like the style or find it more comfortable. I'm sure there's some people who want attention like that, but the problem I have is when people default to assumptions, particularly ones that justify unwanted attention. It just feeds into a larger issue where people believe they have the right to act on their own interpretations of someone's clothing. I wish people would unlearn the habit of attaching motives to other people's choices. Whether someone's outfit is bold or conservative, it doesn't give others a free pass to project their desires or judgments onto them. When I was in high school, I visited a friend's house, and while we were hanging out, her 5-year-old little brother ran out completely naked. It was an odd moment, but not once did I think his lack of clothing justified any predatory behavior. Maybe my brain is wired differently or I'm just not traumatized enough, but I just simply don't understand how people get to a point where they have to blame the clothes. Someone could be completely naked in front of you, and if you were a good person, that doesn't compel you to touch them or behave inappropriately towards them. It's so frustrating how people blame victims for provocative clothing while ignoring the real problem, the person choosing to violate the boundaries. Whether it's a child running around naked or an adult wearing revealing clothing, the responsibility always falls onto the person who acts on disturbing impulses. Good people respect boundaries, period. Speaking of which, let me finish that story with the naked little boy. At one point, I was sitting on the couch, he got in my face, still naked, trying to get my attention. I told him to back away and go put on some pants or at least some underwear. He screamed no. I warned him that if he didn't leave me alone, I was going to hurt him, and when he ignored me again and instead got closer, I pinched his arm to make him back away. Naturally, he began screaming and crying, and my mom's friend came in storming in, furious that I hurt him. She told me I had no rights, and I argued back he needs to learn about boundaries or he's gonna learn the hard way. I might have been an immature high schooler that should have kept my hands to myself at the time. My point still stands. Kids need to learn to respect other people's boundaries just as much as they need to assert their own. Yes, I know it sucks dealing with a bratty kid who can't handle not getting what they want. But if you skip this lesson, your child becomes the adult who becomes the creep who bothers others because they were never forced to respect boundaries. Teaching a child to respect boundaries is a key part of preparing them for a real world where their actions have consequences. Allowing a kid to ignore boundaries under the guise of freedom doesn't foster creativity or independence. It fosters entitlement. It's not gentle parenting when you let your kid walk all over you and others. It's having the emotional intelligence to have a serious conversation like consent with your kid so they still get the messages across without you having to physically or emotionally abuse them. A common phrase uttered is teach your children to be aware of predatory behavior, but also teach your children to not commit to those predatory behaviors. The first step is to model this behavior yourself. If your child tells you not to hug them, respect that boundary. It shows them that their feelings matter. Similarly, if you tell your child to not jump on you, enforce that limit consistently. This isn't just being strict, it's demonstrating that boundaries, once set, are meant to be honored. Children learn the best through example, and when they see you respecting boundaries, they internalize the importance of doing the same for others. This creates a two-way understanding. They feel empowered to say no, and they understand why others might say no to them. This foundation becomes critical in later years when children navigate friendships, relationships, and professional spaces. The topic of consent, especially when teaching children, deserves far more depth than the simple phrase of no means no. While that's an important starting point, it's an incomplete understanding of consent. Consent isn't simply the absence of a no or even just a straight yes. You have to recognize situations where you absolutely cannot accept a yes or when someone revokes that yes with a no. If that feels complicated to you, then it's your responsibility to learn and keep trying until you fully understand it. This kind of ignorance directly leads to harms in ways you could not possibly comprehend. When you dismiss the nuances of consent, you not only end up traumatizing someone, but you also contribute to a culture that excuses violations and silences victims. But I don't know, that's just me. Laters.